A person who refuses to kill in war usually dies first. This is not pessimism. It is mathematical inevitability. War is a mechanism designed to destroy matter. If you put a part into this mechanism that refuses to rotate according to the general laws, the mechanism crushes it. Desmond Doss was just such a part. In 1942, the world went mad. The entire globe turned into a conveyor belt for producing widows and orphans. At that moment, a young man from Virginia declared, "I will go where blood is shed, but I will not take up steel." Imagine the face of the recruiter. Imagine the fury of the sergeant, whose authority is based on fear and discipline. We are used to thinking that strength is expansion. We are taught that in order to protect what is ours, we must be able to suppress what is not ours. But Doss offered a different form of strength, a static one. The strength of a rock that does not strike back, but against which waves break. You are watching this video because you feel that there is a moment in your life when the old methods of defense no longer work. You have accumulated experience, you have accumulated armor, but inside there remains a void. Doss proved that emptiness inside is not a weakness if it is filled with something heavier than lead. Chapter 2. Camp Jackson, School of Hate. The army is a process of erasing individuality. They turn you into a function. The function of a soldier is to be able to destroy the enemy's manpower. If the function fails, it is disposed of. Desmond Doss became the target of the most sophisticated bullying that a male collective can produce. This place was never meant for life. Geographic maps labeled it the Maida Escarpment, but for the soldiers of the 77th Infantry Division, it became Hacksaw Ridge. The name was no metaphor. It was a gargantuan, jagged slab of limestone that heaved itself out of Okinawa like the shattered spine of a prehistoric monster. 40 feet of sheer cliff, a vertical line separating the relative safety of the lowlands from the absolute chaos of the summit. When you look at it from below, you see only gray stone and wisps of smoke. But when you climb the cargo nets to the top, you enter another dimension. There, on the plateau, space narrows to the length of an outstretched arm. There is no horizon. There are only flashes of muzzle fire, gray dust, and a scent that is impossible to forget, a mixture of rotting vegetation, gunpowder, and the metallic aroma of fresh blood. The Japanese had turned this ridge into a masterpiece of fortification. These were not mere trenches, it was an underground city, a honeycomb carved into the stone. Caves connected by tunnels that allowed the enemy to vanish in one spot and reappear in another, right behind the attackers, like ghosts. They did not defend the land, they were the land. Desmond Doss stood at the base of this wall. In his bag were bandages, sulfa powder, and tape. In his mind was a commandment that, here on Okinawa, sounded like a death sentence. Thou shalt not kill. Around him, thousands of men prayed that their bullets would find their mark. Doss prayed that his hands would not shake as he patched the holes left by those very bullets. The assault began not with a heroic cry, but with the mechanical roar of artillery. Shells bit into the limestone, grinding stone into a fine grit that clogged eyes and lungs. When the infantry went up, the sky over Okinawa was crimson. It was an endless cycle. Americans would scramble to the top, seize a few yards of the plateau, and then the Japanese, emerging from their subterranean hives, would unleash a storm of fire, forcing them to tumble back down. But on May 4th, 1945, the balance of power finally collapsed into the abyss. That was the day reality cracked. The Japanese counterattack was so fierce and coordinated that it seemed the mountain itself was vomiting lead. Nambu machine guns worked without overheating, scything down entire rows of soldiers. Artillery blasts turned men into statistics in a split second. In that roar, no orders could be heard, only screams and the whistle of metal. Then came the order, "Retreat!" It was not an organized movement. It was a panicked flight of survivors. Soldiers threw themselves toward the edge of the cliff, clawing at rope ladders, falling downward just to be away from the meat grinder. Back at the base, the commanders counted the losses, and the figures were staggering. At the top, in the smoke, dozens of wounded remained, left to die, left to the mercy of Japanese patrols already emerging from their bunkers with fixed bayonets to clear the territory. At the foot of the ridge, they counted the survivors. But one man did not answer the roll call. Desmond Doss had not come down. He stayed up there at the top, alone, unarmed, in the very heart of the Japanese positions. Imagine the silence that follows a cannonade. It is more terrifying than the explosion itself. In that silence, you begin to hear what the battle drowned out. Gasps, moans, pleas for water. Doss stood in the middle of this field of death, hidden only by a veil of smoke. The logic of war told him, "Run. You've done all you could. You are alone, you are unarmed, you are an easy target." But Doss heard another voice, the voice of those lying in the mud. He began to crawl, inch by inch. His uniform quickly became soaked with blood, and it wasn't his. He found bodies in craters, under the debris of fortifications. He saw the faces of those who had mocked him in the barracks only yesterday. Now, their eyes were full of terror and hope. He didn't just provide aid. He performed the impossible. He transported them. How do you move a paralyzed, critically wounded soldier weighing 200 pounds under sniper fire? Doss invented a system. He dragged them on his back, pressing himself into the very earth, feeling Japanese bullets shear the blades of grass above his head. He dragged them to the edge of the 40-foot drop, and here began the second act of his private miracle. He had only a rope. He tied it around the wounded man's torso with a special knot he had constructed in his mind right there, the double bowline. He looped the rope through his own arms, braced his feet against the cliff's edge, and slowly lowered the man down into the hands of stunned comrades who could not believe what they were seeing. Again and again. One man, another, 5, 10. His hands were shredded to the bone. The rope cut through his gloves and bit into his skin, leaving deep furrows. His muscles screamed with lactic acid. But every time he lowered another soldier, he didn't look down toward safety. He turned back toward the plateau. His lips whispered the same phrase, "Lord, help me get one more." This was not a fanatic's prayer. It was the mantra of a laborer doing the hardest work in the universe. One more. He didn't think of the 75. He didn't think of the Medal of Honor. He thought only of the next man still breathing in that hell. The Japanese were everywhere. Doss heard their voices, heard the clatter of their bayonets. Several times he found himself within a few feet of the enemy, freezing and blending into the ground, becoming part of the landscape of death. Once, a Japanese soldier tried to fire at him, but his rifle jammed. Doss didn't fire back. He had nothing to fire with. He simply continued his work. He worked for 12 hours, all night, through the rain and the smoke. By morning, as the fog began to dissipate, he had lowered 75 men down the cliff. Among them were not only his friends, among them were those who had tried to court-martial him, those who had promised to shoot him in the first battle. He saved them all, making no distinction, because on Hacksaw Ridge, he was not just a soldier or a medic. He was a bridge between life and death. When he finally descended himself, exhausted, covered in mud and blood, with his hands bandaged, he didn't even realize the scale of what had happened. To him, it was just an infinitely long day. But for history, it became the moment when the human spirit officially conquered matter. Hacksaw Ridge remains there, on Okinawa, but the echo of those 12 hours still resonates in the silence of every military museum in the world. It was the day an unarmed man captured a height that armies could not take. He took it not by the force of weapons, but by the power of refusing them. And if you think your difficulties are insurmountable, just remember that cliff. Remember the rope biting into bloodied palms. And remember the quiet voice that, amidst the roar of war, asked not for victory, but for the chance to save one more. Your Hacksaw Ridge is not the place where you fight others. It is the place where you fight your own desire to give up and climb back down. When the guns finally fell silent on Okinawa, the world exhaled a collective sigh of relief. Maps were redrawn, treaties were inked, and the great machinery of slaughter began its slow, grinding halt. But for Desmond Doss, peace did not arrive with the signing of documents. For him, the war simply shifted its geography. Instead of the scorched limestone of Maeda, he found himself entombed within the sterile, chlorine-scented corridors of military wards. This was a long, grueling descent into a personal hell, the segment of his odyssey that never makes it into the triumphal newsreels. There are no camera flashes here, no brass bands, no ticker tape parades. There is only the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock and the ragged, liquid breathing of a man whose body had become a battlefield where the enemy refused to retreat. His body was a map of destruction. Every movement was a brutal reminder of the ridge. The shrapnel from Japanese grenades, which he had once desperately kicked away from his wounded comrades, had stitched itself into his very fiber. Surgeons extracted the jagged metal piece by piece, but some fragments remained buried too deep, fusing with his muscle and bone, becoming a permanent part of his anatomy. The steel of the enemy now flowed in his veins. The sniper's bullet that had shattered his arm had done more than break bone. It had dismantled his future, robbing him of the ability to ever again labor with the hands that had saved 75 souls. But the most terrifying antagonist was neither lead nor steel. It was an invisible, slow-moving killer, tuberculosis. He had contracted it in the rotting, sodden jungles of Leyte long before he ever climbed Hacksaw Ridge. The disease had remained dormant, suppressed by the sheer adrenaline and duty that drove him forward. But the moment the quiet of the hospital took hold, the bacteria began to feast upon his lungs. Imagine a hero, recently honored by the president, locked within the four walls of a hospital for 5 long years. Consider the staggering contrast. America in 1946, 47, and 48 was a nation engulfed in euphoria. Veterans were returning to white picket fence dreams, shiny new sedans, and growing families. The country was entering an era of unprecedented golden prosperity. And yet, the man who embodied the highest virtue of that nation lay in the half-light of a ward, listening to the wheeze in his own chest. His treatment was as radical and unforgiving as the war itself. In the era before effective antibiotics, medicine was a blunt instrument. To save him, surgeons removed his entire left lung. To reach it, they sawed through 5 of his ribs. His chest cavity collapsed. His posture was permanently altered. He was transformed into a physical ghost of the athlete who had once sprinted through machine gun fire. He became a shadow of a hero, encased in a corset of bandages and chronic pain. In this silence, his faith underwent a new, more subtle trial. The trial of infirmity. This was a test far more insidious than the whistle of bullets. On Okinawa, the enemy was clear. There was a target. There was a mission. There was the prayer, "Lord, help me get just one more." But here, in the sterile hush, the question changed. It became, "Lord, why me?" The God who had granted him supernatural strength on the cliff seemed to have left him to wither in the monotony of the sickbed. This was the trial of loneliness and obsolescence. When you are no longer needed at the front, when you are a line item in a budget, when your feats turn into dusty archival entries, and your days consist of nothing but procedures and the wait for the end, most men would break. Most would become bitter, hollow shells, demanding the recognition and the special treatment they felt they were owed. And it was here that Doss performed his second miracle. He did not become bitter. He did not demand privileges. He did not scream at the injustice of saving so many lives while being unable to save his own. Desmond accepted his frailty with the same incomprehensible composure with which he had once stared into the eyes of death. He lay in that silence and learned a new species of courage, the courage to be weak. He realized that his faith was not a contract for immortality or perpetual health. It was a contract for humanity under any circumstances. If he saved others on the ridge, he did something more profound in the hospital. He saved himself from hating the world. He learned that sometimes the most difficult person you are destined to save is yourself. The you that wants to quit, the you that wants to curse fate and stop believing. Doss survived that 5-year siege. He walked out of the hospital as a total disability case, his voice nearly a whisper due to damaged vocal cords and disease, but with a soul as pristine as the day he first refused to touch a rifle. The war was over, but Desmond Doss remained a soldier of the spirit, who knew that the true victory is won not when you crush an enemy, but when you refuse to let pain extinguish your love for life. After the war, a new kind of predator began to circle Desmond Doss. They didn't carry Nambu machine guns or fixed bayonets. They carried contracts, fountain pens, and promises of global immortality. For nearly 60 years, Hollywood, the world's most powerful machine for turning truth into myth, attempted to storm the heights of Doss's life. And for 60 years, the man who had stood unarmed against an army stood alone against the seductive power of the screen. The lure of the lens is a dangerous thing. We live in a culture that believes a story isn't real until it has been projected onto a silver screen. We think that fame is the ultimate validation of a life well lived. But to Desmond Doss, the glare of Hollywood spotlights was not an honor, it was a threat. He understood something that we, in our era of viral fame and digital vanity, have forgotten. That once you hand your truth to someone else, it is no longer yours. It becomes a product. It becomes a narrative. Imagine the scene in the late 1940s and 1950s. Producers from the biggest studios in the world were trekking to his modest home. They offered him sums of money that would have instantly ended his post-war poverty. They promised to make him the face of American heroism, a star alongside John Wayne or Audie Murphy. They wanted to turn Hacksaw Ridge into a blockbuster while the soil of Okinawa was still damp with blood. But Doss looked at the fine print of their intentions. He saw what they wanted to do. They wanted to streamline his faith. They wanted to make the action louder and the prayer quieter. They suggested that perhaps, for the sake of the audience, he could carry a weapon just for one scene. Or perhaps he could kill just one enemy in a moment of righteous fury. They wanted to turn a miracle of spiritual conviction into a standard revenge flick. Doss's response was always the same quiet, immovable, no. This was his second great battle, a war against the distortion of his own soul. He wasn't protecting his ego, he was protecting the sanctity of what happened on that ridge. He believed that the glory belonged to God, not to a studio's quarterly earnings report. He knew that if he allowed them to turn his life into a lie, he would be betraying every man he had lowered down that cliff. To him, an embellished truth was simply a decorated lie. Decades passed. The world changed. The 1960s brought a cynical view of war. The 1970s brought a darker realism. Still, the offers came. Directors told him they would be gritty and authentic. But Doss remained skeptical. He saw how the screen had a way of romanticizing violence, of making the carnage look beautiful, of making the act of killing look like a solution rather than a tragedy. He lived in a world of absolute silence due to his hearing loss, but his internal compass was louder than ever. He lived in a small house, often struggling to pay for the basic necessities of a disabled life, while sitting on a story worth millions. Think about that choice. In our 30s and 40s, we often compromise our values for far less. A slightly higher salary, a bit of social standing, a moment of convenience. Doss stayed in his fortress of integrity for over half a century. He was waiting for a generation that was ready to hear the story without the filter of propaganda or the stain of sensationalism. This chapter of his life is a direct challenge to the viewer. We spend our lives trying to be seen. We post, we share, we crave the like, the validation of the stranger. We are terrified of being forgotten. Doss was terrified of being remembered for the wrong reasons. He understood that silence is often more powerful than the loudest broadcast. By refusing to let his story be told for 60 years, he ensured that when it finally was told, it would land with the weight of an ancient scripture rather than the transience of a summer popcorn movie. It wasn't until the very end of his life, when he was nearly 87 years old, that he finally relented. He didn't do it for the money. He was beyond the need for it. He did it because he realized his time was running out, and the message of non-violence in the heart of violence was needed more than ever in a world that had forgotten how to be human. He didn't want a movie. He wanted a witness. The battle against the screen was won. When the world finally saw Hacksaw Ridge, they saw a man who had outlasted his critics, outlasted the censors, and outlasted the trendsetters. He had forced Hollywood to play by his rules. He had forced the screen to reflect his light rather than the other way around. But there is a cold, sharp truth remaining here for us. Doss is gone. The movie has been made. The credits have rolled. And now, the screen is in our hands, every day, in our pockets, on our desks. We are constantly tempted to perform our lives rather than live them. We are tempted to trade our deepest convictions for a moment of being watched. Doss's 60-year silence is a scream in the ear of the modern world. It asks us, what is your truth worth? Would you stay in the dark for 60 years to keep your soul clean? Or would you sell it for the first flash of a camera? The war against the screen isn't over. It's a war you are fighting right now as you watch this. The question isn't whether you will be remembered. The question is whether the you that is remembered is the real you, or just a character written by someone else. As the decades began to thin out and the world around him accelerated into the digital age, Desmond Doss entered his final and perhaps most profound transformation. He became the last witness. This was no longer about the physical act of saving lives on a cliff, nor was it about the struggle to keep his story pure. It was about the weight of carrying a truth that the rest of the world had begun to treat as an impossible myth. To be the last of your kind is a lonely form of greatness. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the men who had stood on Hacksaw Ridge were mostly gone. The voices that once screamed in the mud of Okinawa had faded into the rustle of history books. Doss remained, a living, breathing bridge between an era of total sacrifice and an era of total distraction. But he was a bridge that lived in a world of absolute, crushing silence. The antibiotics used to save his life from tuberculosis decades earlier had exacted a final price. By 1976, he was completely deaf. For the last 30 years of his life, the man who had listened for the faintest moans of the dying lived in a sensory void. He communicated through the scratched ink of pens on yellow legal pads, reading the world through the movement of lips and the vibrations of the air. This silence was not a cage, it was a sanctuary. In our modern world, we are terrified of silence. We fill every gap with noise, every second with a notification, every thought with a distraction. We fear what we might hear if the world stops talking. But Doss embraced it. In that silence, he refined his message until it was as sharp and clear as a diamond. He didn't need to hear the applause of the world to know he had done his duty. He didn't need the validation of the news cycle. He sat in his quiet home, a last witness to a brand of morality that was becoming increasingly alien to the 21st century. There is a haunting power in his return to Okinawa as an old man. Imagine him, frail, leaning on a cane, standing once again at the edge of the Maeda escarpment. The smoke was gone. The screams were replaced by the sound of the wind through the trees. The hacksaw was now a place of greenery and peace. Here, the final layer of his story unfolded. He met with Japanese veterans, men who had been on the other side of the bayonets that night. In any other story, this would be a moment of tension. But for the last witness, there was only a profound, shared understanding of the tragedy of man. The Japanese looked at this old, deaf man not as a former enemy, but as a sensei of life. They saw in him a warrior who had mastered the hardest battle of all, the battle against the impulse to hate. He had saved Americans, but in doing so, he had upheld a standard of mercy that transcended nations. He was no longer a soldier of the United States, he was a witness for humanity itself. As 2006 approached, his health began to fade for the final time. The single lung that had powered him through 87 years of life was finally tired. But even as his body failed, his presence grew more intense. People would travel across the country just to sit in the same room as him, even if they couldn't speak to him. They didn't come for the stories, they came for the gravity. They came to see if it was true, if a man could really live a whole life without breaking his bond with his soul. His death on March 23, 2006, was not a tragedy, it was a completion. When he took his last breath, the last witness handed the torch to us. The silence he lived in for 30 years was finally broken, not by the sounds of this world, but by the quiet, well done of the eternity he had worked for. But here is the cold reality that remains after the screen goes dark. When a witness dies, the truth becomes a choice for those left behind. As long as Doss was alive, he was a physical proof that you don't have to be a killer to be a hero. He was proof that you can be unfit for service in the eyes of men and perfectly calibrated in the eyes of God. Now that he is gone, the world wants to turn him back into a character. We want to put him in a movie, watch him for 2 hours, feel a brief surge of inspiration, and then go back to our lives of compromise and noise. We want to treat his life like a fairy tale, so we don't have to feel the pressure of his example. The last witness is gone, but the testimony is still in the air. You are the jury now. You've watched the chapters of his life, the barracks, the cliff, the hospital, the silence. You've seen a man who was beaten, belittled, broken, and buried, yet who never once reached for a weapon to defend himself. The future we spoke of at the beginning is no longer coming. It is here. The world is getting louder, more aggressive, and more divided. It is demanding that you choose a side, that you pick up a weapon, that you join the noise. Desmond Doss's final message wasn't written on a notepad or spoken into a microphone. It was written in the 75 families that exist today because of him. It was written in the 60 years of integrity he maintained when he could have sold out. It was written in the silence of his final years. The question is, what will you do with the silence he left behind? Will you fill it with your own excuses? Or will you find the strength to stand unarmed in your own life, protecting what is sacred while everyone else is busy attacking? The last witness has finished his work. The rope has been coiled. The cliff has been cleared. The rest is up to you. Don't look for another hero. Become a witness to the truth that Doss died to protect. That the greatest power in the world isn't the ability to take a life, but the courage to save one, even if it's just your own.